Hello everyone, so today we're going to be taking a look at section 2 of the CSEC Textile Clothing and Fashion syllabus. The section is called Textile Coloring and Finishing. So we're going to look a lot at how we add color to fabric, how we effect, visual effects to fabric. And we're going to start off with the terms, or a couple of terms relating to color. First one we have is colorimeter. So the colorimeter is actually an instrument that we use to measure the intensity of color. And later on, we're going to see what we mean when we say intensity of color. For now, you just have to know that your colorimeter or your colorimeter is going to measure the intensity of a color. We have the prism, which is something you probably have seen before in science, physics specifically. It refers to this instrument that we use to split white light. So as we see light, it tends to be all of the colors of light combined, which is what gives us white light. But with a prism, you're able to split that white light into different colors. So that is how we're able to see different colors on the spectrum. Prism allows us to do that. Value refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. And if you look at the example I have here, we see red starts off very light and then it gets dark. So the one with the darker appearance would be the one with the lower value. And the one with the lighter appearance is what would have the higher value. Intensity refers to the brightness or dullness of a color. And similarly, saturation also refers to the brightness or dullness of a color. So you could use these terms interchangeably, intensity and saturation. And I have an example here where we're looking at different colors. And each color, you're able to see a more intense version on top or a more saturated version on top. And you are able to see a less intense or a less saturated of that color below. So intensity and saturation, basically the same thing, and it refers to how bright or how dull a color is, or how subdued it might be. It will have a lower saturation or lower intensity, has a subdued appearance, and you'll see another term that we use to refer specifically to subdued appearance colors later on. Now we want to look at hue, tint, shades, and tones, and you want to learn those four terms together because learning them will kind of help you to differentiate. So we have hue. We'll start off with hue, which is a pure color. So just as a color would appear on the color wheel, that is the hue. Now, if you were to add white to the hue, you'll get a tint. So you'll get a lighter version of this color. If you were to add black to this hue, you would get a shade or a darker version of this color. And if you were to add gray to this hue, you would get a tone. So I don't want to say a lighter or darker version, somewhere in between, but adding these pigments at varied amounts would give you different effects or different versions of the hue or different versions of the color. So we could use the term hue interchangeably with the term color because that is essentially the pure color. But tints would be an addition of white, shades would be an addition of black, and tones would be an addition of gray. Now pastels, like I would have mentioned before, some colors tend to be softer and subdued in appearance. In other words, they have lower intensity or they have lower saturation. So if you notice, pastel colors, that is a term that we can use to describe these kinds of colors. So just utilizing a term that we would have already learned, intensity and saturation, the brightness or the dullness of a color. So if you have dull or more subdued versions of these colors, you can consider them as pastels, right? Then we have neutrals. Neutrals don't appear on the color wheel, so you're not going to see browns, grays, and beige and these kind of colors on the color wheel, but they are colors that kind of help to promote balance in our color schemes. So you may have a color scheme where you want to use bright colors and the neutral colors just sort of bring it back down from looking all crazy. So your neutrals are very important, and based on the warmth or the coolness of the colors or the effect that you're going for, which we'll later on see, you can use grays accordingly, or you can use beiges and tans accordingly, browns accordingly. So let's take a look at the color wheel. Our color wheel is, you can see it at three levels, or you can imagine it at three levels. The first level, or the basic level, would be the primary colors. Our primary colors consist of red, blue, and yellow. Now, these colors cannot be mixed, or they can, when I say they cannot be mixed, they cannot be created by mixing. So I cannot create the color red by mixing any other two colors. However, our secondary and tertiary colors we are able to create by mixing. How do we do that? For our secondary colors, we'll have to mix two primary colors in equal proportions. So let's say, for example, I mix 1 drop of blue with 1 drop of yellow, I'm going to get green, right? Because I've mixed two primary colors in equal proportions. If I were to mix 1 drop of red with 1 drop of yellow, I will get orange because I've mixed two primary colors in equal proportions. So my orange and my green would be considered secondary colors. Now, if I were to attempt mixing out tertiary colors, I can do that in two ways. I can either mix my primary colors in unequal proportions. So let's say, for example, I mixed red and blue, but I probably put a little more red than I did put blue. I will end up with a red purple. So it's not really, it's not a secondary color because it's not even. It's not smack in the middle or between red and blue, but it is somewhere closer to the red side. However, it's not pure red. So these are going to be our tertiary colors. They're sort of intermediate or in between our primary and our secondary colors. Another way you can make a tertiary color is if you were to mix a secondary color, so a secondary color that you have already made, let's say you've made purple already, and you want to add a primary color to it. So maybe I have my purple, but I want it to appear more blue. So I can add a bit more blue to my purple to achieve blue purple. Now, blue purple is not smack in the middle or in between red and blue, so it's not a secondary color. It will be a tertiary color because it's in between a secondary and a primary color. Now, notice that I use the primary color name before using the secondary color name when referring to tertiary colors. It's important that the dominant color is what you would put first, right? So you're never gonna hear orange, yellow. Orange is the secondary color. Yellow is what's dominant in this orange, so it's going to be called yellow orange, right? So if I come across an orange that is a bit more on the yellow side, I'm going to call it yellow orange because it was made from a combination of red and yellow, but more yellow was used, okay? So let me just run that through again using probably one example so it doesn't get confusing. Let's say I were to make green. I would mix my primary colors, blue and yellow, to get in even proportions to get green, right? So let's say I mix 1 drop of blue and 1 drop of yellow, I would end up with like 2 drops of green. Now, if I were to try to make a tertiary color from this green, I can add maybe an extra drop of yellow or just a little extra, maybe an extra half drop of yellow. This green now would shift more to the yellow side. It is no longer in between, or right down the middle in between yellow and blue. It is now shifting more to the yellow side. So it is now a tertiary color, and we're going to refer to that tertiary color as yellow-green. Now, some of these tertiary colors have different names. For example, yellow-green, you may tend to call it lime green, and that's fine. But you just need to know what makes it, right? So that essentially wraps up our primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. I hope that is straightforward. Now, complementary colors would refer to the colors that lay directly opposite each other on the color wheel. Why do we use complementary colors? Complementary colors help to sort of create a color scheme that's very easy to come by. And you would later on see, or you would see in maybe different examples, different ways of creating different color schemes. Color schemes are how you put colors together. So say, for example, I have a project and I have, you have a design in mind, but obviously that design is brought to life when you use color. So what colors will I use together? That is where the color scheme concept was born. Understanding what colors you would want to use together and what colors complement each other, or what colors look good together, that is the basis or the fundamentals of a color scheme. So complementary colors start to help to build a complementary color scheme, and you can do that by using colors that are directly opposite each other on a color wheel. So for example, red and green, they lie directly opposite each other on the color wheel. These are complementary colors. So complementary colors come in pairs. So you're never going to hear, oh, red is a complementary color. Red complements green. So it comes in pairs. It's always two because it's opposite each other on the color wheel. Naturally so, blue would complement orange. So you can just try using different colors and just see what lies opposite the color on the color wheel, and that would be your complementary colors, or that would be a complementary color pair, right? Now, I should note that sometimes the complementary colors, they don't always give you the desired effect as they appear on the color wheel. So maybe I might want to use different tints or shades of red or different tints or shades of green that give whatever desired effect that I want. You don't have to use it exactly as it appears on the color. Now, earlier I spoke about warm colors and cooler colors or the effects that colors can produce. And I was talking about neutrals. Now, any color that gives off or is more leaning towards the yellow and red side of the color wheel, they would produce a warm effect. And any color that leans more towards the green and blue side of the color wheel, they produce a cooling effect, right? Or cooling visual effect. So it's important to know the effects that your colors will um, produce so that you understand how to use it in different color schemes that you may want to create. Now, let's move on to reasons for coloring fabric. Generally, you have two reasons. You want to make your fabric more attractive, or you want to add value to your fabric. Either way, fabric as it is just plain straight from the factory is not necessarily attractive, and it's not necessarily going to go for the highest value. So adding color to your fabric can make uh, an attractive effect, and it can also add to the value or increase the value of your fabric. Now, there are different ways we could add color to our fabric. One of the more common ways is dye. So dyeing our fabric generally would allow us to add color to our fabric. However, I should say that it's not all fabric that you can dye. Dyes tend to adhere to natural fibers. So your synthetic fibers would not be able to, maybe it might pick up some of the dye, but it would not be able to retain the dye, right? So our natural fibers are the fibers that we are able to dye. So if our fibers come from animal sources or plant sources, we're able to dye it simply because the surface of these fibers are more porous and they're able to retain or adhere to the dye components, right? Now, if you have synthetic fibers, the surface of these fibers are not going to be as porous. They're not going to be able to adhere. The dye might stay for a little while, but it's right off. So think about dyeing natural hair versus dyeing synthetic hair. It is, you would get more of a desired or a long-term effect if you were to dye natural hair as opposed to synthetic hair. So just think of that same concept for dyeing fabrics. Natural fabrics always. Now, we have dyes that can be natural and we have dyes that can be synthetic. As the name suggests, natural dyes come from the environment and you can get them from plants as well as animal sources. So there are some plants that produce very strong pigments, for example, berries, dark leaves, wood, turmeric, things like beets. These things produce very strong pigments and you're able to use them to dye your fabrics. There are also some insects that produce very strong pigments and you're able to use those as dyes. Again, might not be the most ethical practice, but this is an option. Synthetic dyes are created in the lab from scratch, and you have a couple like basic fusion, acid fusion, crystal violets, etc. So these are synthesized and they tend to be used more frequently. Obviously, because they would be in more, they would be in a higher supply, and it's just more efficient or easier to um, obtain synthetic dyes as opposed to natural dyes, which require a process. But again, it depends on whatever is your desired effect, what you're going for. If you're going for something more organic, if you're going for something more natural, you may want to stick to natural dyes. but your I should say that your options are a bit more your variety is more when you use synthetic dyes, even though it's not natural. So let's move on to the different methods for color application. Like I said, one of the more common ones is dyeing. And you could dye your fabric completely. Let's say you want your fabric to go from white to red. You can dye it completely red. However, if you want to get designs, there's something called, or there are techniques called resist dye, which would allow you to create different designs or effects on your fabric while still dyeing it. So the concept of resist dye is to allow dye to go onto the majority of the fabric or the areas of the fabric that you want the dye to go onto, and then find ways or use different techniques to resist the dye or to not allow the dye to go onto the fabric in different areas. So let's say you were trying to create a design, maybe something abstract, where there were just certain parts that you did not want to dye. You would have to use different methods. For example, if you were to tie it, or if you were to put wax on it, or if you were to stitch it. And this is the birth, or this is where resist dyeing methods would have started, right? So one of the common ones we know is tie dyeing. So anywhere that you want to create a pattern, you will tie it, or anywhere that you want the dye not to go, you will tie it. And most times this is done in a very abstract way, but there are different techniques that give you more regular designs or specific designs. But generally it is an abstract art. And wherever you tie, the dye would not go. And once you immerse it into the dye, you remove it, you squeeze, you rinse, and you remove your strings or your rubber bands, your pattern will remain. Now, if it is that you want to, I should also mention, if you want to dye using multiple colors, you will have to use the darker colors first, because if you were to use lighter colors and then use darker colors, the darker colors will mask the lighter colors. So it's important to start with the darker colors, and as you remove the ties or you remove whatever resist method that you would have used, then you can introduce the lighter colors because they will be able to go over the darker colors without masking them. I should also mention that when creating a dye bath, because if you are to dye by immersion, there are many different methods of dyeing these days. You can spray dye onto fabric. Some people try to apply dye in different ways. But if you were to immerse your fabric into the dye bath, you will have to create a dye bath with maybe your warm water, if it's a warm water dye, your salt, which is a mordant, and what mordants do is they help the dye to stay or adhere onto the fabric. So your dye effect would last longer if you use a mordant. So your dye bath would essentially consist of your dye, your warm water or cool water, depending on what instructions you're given for creating the dye bath, and a mordant. And generally we use common salt, sodium chloride, right? Now, once you created that dye bath, then you immerse your fabric, whether you decided to tie dye it or batik it, etc. We'll go into some different techniques, but I just want you to note that all of the resist methods simply require you to create your design, resist, or create your design by resisting in different ways, and then you can immerse your fabric into the dye bath and proceed to rinse afterwards. So in the case of tie-dyeing, the resist method was tying or using strings or rubber bands. In the case of batiking, again, similar process, but your resist method that would be wax, right? Now you can use a combination of paraffin, which is candle wax, or beeswax. Well, a combination of paraffin and beeswax, or some people use just paraffin, some people use just beeswax. But I find there's a sweet spot in between mixing the paraffin with the beeswax. Sometimes you tend to get a better texture than if you were to just use straight beeswax. So with the batiking now, you do have to utilize a tool called a shantin, which is kind of like a pencil funnel in a way. It allows you to apply the dye in a nice steady form without, let me just try to get an image of a Johnson so that you're able to see. So your Johnson basically allows you to um, apply the dye. The dye goes into this kind of funnel area, and it's just applied or it's released through a smaller nozzle in a way, and you're able to create your designs. And then later on, when you dye a fabric, everywhere that the wax is, it would not get the color. So that is how your design is created. Now, as I was saying, you can use the Johnson, or you can use, for example, I've had instances where my students use paint brushes. So we would have melted the wax and then we use paint brushes to apply. Some students may have dripped the wax on in different abstract designs, etc. So the application may vary, but traditionally, persons use a Johnson, which gives you a nice control effect as to how you apply the wax. But again, just to reinforce that your wax will be applied as a resist method, and then you will proceed to immerse your fabric into the dye bath for a few minutes, rinse, and then remove your resist method. Another resist method is clamp dyeing. So this is where you will use pieces of wood shaped into whatever shape that you desire. And that is now clamped in place, and that is what would resist your dye. So in this picture, you will see the clamps were probably triangular shaped. And again, this could be abstract as well. Maybe it could be some other different design, but once it's clamped together, wherever it's clamped, the dye would not absorb. Tritic is another example, and this uses stitching as a resist method as opposed to tying or waxing or clamping, right? And as you can see, the effects created by the different resist methods, they vary. Starch paste is an example of, or is an alternate to using wax. So sometimes some people might call it starch paste or glue. Um, Using glue to create the effect or create the designs, but it's essentially like the same concept as that's in this case. Let's say you were to use starch paste or glue, you would create your design and then you have to let it dry. So by letting it dry, when you place it into the dye bath, wherever the dried glue is, no dye will be absorbed. That's how you create your design. So I hope all of this is straightforward. I hope that it makes sense. But these are the examples of resist dyeing that you should know. Now, apart from dyeing, we do have some other ways of applying color to fabric. We have printing, and we have three methods of printing that we want you to know at this stage. There's screen printing, which you will use a screen that will have an image on it, and this image can be transferred by manipulating a tool called a squeegee, and the ink or whatever medium is used to transfer that image onto the t-shirt or bag or whatever it is that you're printing onto. That would the squeegee is basically pressing that along the screen, and then it will be transferred because the image now is the area is going to allow that medium to absorb or to go through the screen and now be transferred onto the fabric below. So this could be time consuming, but it is one of the more traditional or original ways of printing. And of course, it allows you to, you can customize the screen as much as you want, or you can change it around, but obviously you're only able to use one color at a time, which is one of the setbacks with screen printing. You have roller printing as well, and this would involve rotary cylinders. So the cylinder sorter, I don't know if you have ever used like a lint roller and you see how it like rolls along your clothing. So your cylinder sort of just roll along the fabric, and whatever design is on the cylinder, the color or the pigment that's inside will now be transferred onto the fabric in that design. So this is excellent for repeated or continuous designs that you're trying to create. But as you see, there isn't much variation, or it's very rigid, or it sticks to a repeated pattern. Now we also have block printing, where you create a motif. Now you can do this using wood as in the picture, but you can also use things like sponge, or you can use things like potatoes, soap, whatever it is that you use to create your motif. Once you created it, you can just add paint, or if it's dye, or if it's ink, whatever it is that whatever medium you decide to use, you apply that to your motif, or you apply that to your shape, and then you stamp it onto the fabric. And the beauty about this is that you can do it in whatever pattern you want, or at whatever consistency you want. But the design is all up to you. One of the setbacks with this is that it being a manual process, if you have like lots of fabric to actually design, it could be a time consuming, and it requires you to have some skill. It requires you to be very steady with your hands. So that that's about it for printing. We have screen printing, roller printing, and block printing. Now let's look at some other surface techniques. Now, surface techniques really refer to the application of designs that may manipulate the texture of your fabric. So painting, for example, is a surface technique. You will be using paint and applying it to whatever design onto your fabric, and it leaves the appearance is one thing, but it also changes the texture of your fabric. So as you maybe pass your hand along the fabric, you can feel that raised or flattened effect based on maybe what paint you use or how you would have applied the paint. We also have stenciling, and stencils are not new. They have been, I'm sure, you may have used stencils as a child, um, probably for writing and whatnot, but we can also use stencils for designs. So you will create the design, and it would be probably printed onto stencil material, or stencil paper, stencil block. I'm not sure what you would refer to this as, but once it's cut out, or the design is transferred onto the stencil and the areas or the negatives are removed, then you're able to paint over, or you're able to probably pass a sponge or some, something to apply, maybe dye or paint or so onto it. So all of the spaces that are covered, or all of the spaces that were not cut out from the stencil, they would remain unpainted or undyed, and the areas that were removed will, get the design. So this is a really nice and simple way to create a repeated effect. But this can also be created, or stencils can also be created using computer aided design, other technological aspects. Now we also have embroidery, which is a very common one, simply because a lot of people tend to do it as a crafty alternative to maybe printing or painting onto your fabric. It utilizes colorful threads that you can now manipulate with different stitches to create the desired effect. So some of the stitches that you may recognize in this picture would be like your chain stitch or your stem stitch. We also have satin stitch here and there. And there are a number of different stitches that you can use to create different effects or different images onto your fabric. We also have texturing, which would um, create a tactile effect. So as you place your hand over, you would feel, even if you were to close your eyes, you would feel the varying texture based on what was done to the fabric. So in one picture, we have that it was probably tied at different points and filled with maybe some sort of cottony um, fiber, or something to create that spherical effect at different points, like almost like little pom-poms. And in another picture, we have sort of like a snake-skinned sort of effect created. I'm not sure what would have been used to create this, but all of this refers to how the fabric can now change in terms of texture. Now, speaking of changes in fabric, let's move over to fabric finishes. Now, as we would have gone through all of these different ways of adding color to fabric, I should mention that technically these are decorative finishes, but what do I mean when I say fabric finishes? Fabric finishes are ways to enhance your fabric. After your fabric has been created, maybe, it can be enhanced for performance, or maybe it can be enhanced in terms of aesthetics. These are what your fabric finishes are for. And you have three major types of fabric finishes. We have preparatory fabric finishes. These fabric finishes prepare your fabric for another stage. For example, if I have a bale of cotton and that cotton now had to be dyed, one of the preparatory finishes that I may want to do is bleach it, because bleaching it now ensures that I have a whiter surface to work with, and that would mean that my color would, whatever color I'm dyeing it with, will show up more vibrant. So these are your preparatory finishes. They prepare your fabric for another stage of processing. Your functional finishes refer to finishes that enhance performance. So for example, there may be fabrics that are too lightweight and they do not give the effect that you want it to give. So adding metallic salt to the fabric would add weight to it and helps it to fall better. Of course, some of these fabric finishes are not permanent. So maybe on washing once, twice, or three times, you can lose some of the effects that were created initially when you have added this fabric finishes. Um, Decorative finishes would be our last or third category of fabric finishes. These are more aesthetic. So you have things like moiring, which creates this wavy wooden effect. And then you have things like embossing, which creates a raised effect, and the designs can vary. Napping creates sort of like, and you can see this with blankets and stuff, they create a fuzzy effect. Plissing is one that creates a crinkled crepe effect. And all of these are really interesting ways to enhance your fabric in terms of appearance. And calendering creates, I don't know if you know what PU leather, it creates that kind of latex glossy effect. So this basically wraps everything up for textile coloring and finishes. Now remember that, let's go from the top. Remember that we have some terms that we want to make sure we remember as it relates to colorimeter, prism, value, intensity, and saturation, hue, tints, shades, tones, pastels, neutrals. You also want to make sure that you understand how the color wheel is categorize the colors on the color wheel, how you can categorize them, or how you can build a color wheel using your primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, and how the colors are made. Maybe what two colors would make what. These are things you can test yourself on. We looked at the complementary colors. They fall opposite each other on the color wheel, and they come in pairs. So red and green is just one example. So you can look through the color wheel for different examples. We have warm and cool colors. And we also looked at why we color fabric. So after learning about color, we looked at how we introduce it to the fabric, why we introduce it to the and then we looked at different ways we introduce it to fabric. So, for example, we looked at dyeing, which is a very common way of introducing fabric. And we looked at the fact that we have natural and synthetic dyes. We looked at a few examples. And then we looked at ways of dyeing. We looked specifically at different methods of resist dyeing, like tie-dye, batik, pump dyeing, tritic, and the starch base. Then we looked at other ways of applying fabric that were not necessarily related to dyeing. So, for example, printing. We saw three examples of those, or three types of printing: screen printing, roller printing, and block printing. And then we also looked at surface techniques, which utilize other application methods that tend to change the way the surface of our fabric feels. So we looked at painting, stenciling, embroidering, and texturing. Then we moved on to fabric finishes, and we learned that there were three types. We have preparation, functional, and decorative. And we zoomed in a little more to each, our preparatory, our functional, and decorative finishes. All in all, I hope this helps. And of course, feel free to share to anyone else that will find this beneficial.